Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Huria Amir, Head of Physiology Department, Faisalabad Medical University. Today we are going to learn about the basal ganglia and their motor functions. Now, before starting them learning in detail, let's talk about them, the components of basal ganglia one by one. Now, what are the basal ganglia's parts? They are corpus striatum, which is composed of caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus. Then we have globus pallidus, putamen. Then substantia nigra, subthalamic nucleus, and red nucleus. The basal ganglia, like the cerebellum, constitute another accessory motor system that functions, usually not by itself but in close association with the cerebral cortex and corticospinal motor control system. This accessory motor system is working. So we can say that the motor system, which is mainly the part of the cerebral cortex, is working in close collaboration with that of the midbrain, red nucleus, the basal ganglia, cerebellum, so that there should be a harmony of motor activity going to take place in our body. In fact, the basal ganglia receive most of their input signals from the cerebral cortex itself. So they return almost all their output signals back to the cortex. You can see the presence of the different parts of the basal ganglia. You can see there is putamen, globus pallidus, then there is caudate nucleus, then there is subthalamic nucleus, there is a red nucleus. Now we should be knowing about the neuronal circuitry of the basal ganglia. The anatomical connections between the basal ganglia and the other brain elements that provide motor control are complex. There is presence of two major circuits, and what are they? These two neuronal circuits, they are the putamen circuit and the caudate circuit. You can see, and all of you are supposed to draw and label these putamen and caudate circuits. Now the function of the basal ganglia in executing patterns of motor activity. The putamen circuit, one of the principal roles of the basal ganglia in motor control, is to function in association with the corticospinal system to control complex patterns of motor activity. For example, the writing of letters of alphabet. A serious damage to the basal ganglia cortical system of motor control can no longer provide these patterns, and one's writing becomes crude. So we can say that it is the function of the basal ganglia to provide the accuracy to the motor activity, to provide the beautification to that of the motor activity. Now, other patterns that require the basal ganglia, they are where the precision of movement that is very much required. And what are they? They are cutting paper with scissors, hammering the nails at proper position, then most aspects of vocalization, the controlled movements of the eyes, and any other skilled movements performed subconsciously. Now the neural pathways of the putamen circuit. They begin in the premotor and supplementary areas of the motor cortex and in the somatosensory areas of the sensory cortex. Putamen, bypassing the caudate nucleus, goes to the internal portion of the globus pallidus, ventroanterior and ventrolateral relay nuclei of the thalamus, and they return to the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, and supplementary areas closely associated with the primary motor cortex. Ancillary circuits from the putamen, external globus pallidus, subthalamus, and the substantia nigra, and finally returning to the motor cortex by way of the thalamus. You can see the putamen circuitry. Now, if there is abnormal functioning of the putamen circuit, what will happen to an individual? You can see that there is athetosis, hemiballismus, and chorea. If there is presence of lesions in the globus pallidus, what will happen in that individual is that there is presence of spontaneous, continuous writhing movements of a hand, an arm, the neck, or the face, and that is leading to athetosis. If there is lesion in the subthalamus, there is sudden flailing movements of an entire limb, that is hemiballismus. If there is presence of multiple small lesions in the putamen, flicking movements in the hands, face, and other parts of the body, the person is going to suffer from chorea. Lesions of substantia nigra leads to the common and extremely severe disease. And what is that? That is the composition of rigidity, akinesia, and tremors. They are going to lead to Parkinson's disease. Now, role of the basal ganglia for cognitive control of sequence of motor patterns. Cognition, what is it? The thinking process of the brain using both the sensory input to brain plus the information already stored in the memory, that is the cognition. Most of our motor actions occur as a consequence of thoughts generated in the mind, and that is known as the cognitive control of motor activity. And the caudate nucleus plays a major role in cognitive control of motor activity. You can see the caudate circuit cognitive planning, how it is going on, that the information they are going directly to the prefrontal area, to premotor, supplemental motor areas, somatosensory areas, information that are coming from these areas, and then they are going to the thalamus, and then from thalamus they are going back. So this is how the circuitry is going on. The caudate circuit, the signals they pass from cerebral cortex to caudate nucleus, internal globus pallidus, the relay nuclei of ventrointerior and ventrolateral thalamus, and finally back to the prefrontal, premotor, and supplementary motor areas of the cerebral cortex. The returning signals. Now, accessory motor regions in the premotor and supplementary motor areas that are concerned with putting together the sequential patterns of movement lasting 5 or more seconds instead of exciting the individual muscle movements. For example, a line is approaching and the responses. Now, cognitive control of motor activity determines subconsciously and within seconds which pattern of movement will be used together to achieve a complex goal that might itself last for many seconds. Now, functions of specific neurotransmitters. Substances in the basal ganglia. You can be asked about the basal ganglia neurotransmitters. Dopamine pathways from the substantia nigra to caudate nucleus and putamen. Gamma-aminobutyric acid pathways from the caudate nucleus and putamen to the globus pallidus and substantia nigra. Then acetylcholine pathways from the cortex to the caudate nucleus and putamen. You can see the release of these neurotransmitters from different portions of the basal ganglia. Now, the multiple general pathways from the brain stem that secrete norepinephrine, serotonin, enkephalin, and several other neurotransmitters in the basal ganglia as well as in other parts of the cerebrum. Now, there are multiple glutamate pathways that provide most of the excitatory signals. Now, these balance out the large numbers of inhibitory signals transmitted especially by the dopamine, gamma-aminobutyric acid, and serotonin inhibitory transmitters. Therefore, the gamma-aminobutyric acid neurons in the feedback loop from the cortex through the basal ganglia and then back to the cortex make virtually all these loops negative feedback loops rather than the positive feedback loops. So, they are going to provide the stability to the motor control system. So, you can be asked how the stability of motor control function is actually taking place. Now, functions of basal ganglia to change the timing and to scale the intensity of movements. Now, the two important capabilities of the brain in controlling movement are to determine how rapidly the movement is to be performed, to control how large the movement will be. Now, lesions of posterior parietal cortex produces an inability to accurately perceive objects through normally functioning sensory mechanisms, and that is known as agnosia. What is agnosia? Agnosia is actually a condition in which the person is having inability to accurately perceive the objects through normally functioning sensory mechanism. Now, a person with a lesion in the right posterior parietal cortex might try to copy drawings, but the patient's ability to copy the left side of the drawings is severely impaired. Such a person will always try to avoid using his or her left arm, left hand, or other portions of his or her body for the performance of the tasks or even to wash this side of the body. And that is known as the personal neglect syndrome. So you can be asked about this condition. What is personal neglect syndrome? That if a person is having a lesion on one of their inhibition, that is tremor of Parkinsonism.